And with that, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Kelly Campbell, and I am the Associate Director of the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at Cal State San Bernardino. Our institute serves children, parents, and families in the inland region through research, education, and applied services. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jurgita Abramovichute and Dr. Emily Carrion. Dr. Abramovichute is an assistant professor in the sociology department at CSUSB. Her research focuses on gender inequality, workplace penalties and premiums, and work life balance issues. Dr. Carrion is also a professor, an assistant professor in the sociology department at CSUSB. Her research examines the mechanisms that make gender inequality so difficult to eradicate across a variety of contexts and populations. So I will now turn it over to our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abramovichute and Dr. Carrion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell, for your introduction, and thanks to ICDFR for hosting this event. So today's webinar is titled When Work and Family Collide, How Couples Navigate Household Labor During the Pandemic. And so we are going to share some key findings from the research that we conducted in the past year. And at the very end, we are going to have some takeaway lessons. So we are hoping that you will stick around. I also wanted to note that you can ask questions in the chat, and we will make sure to answer them at the very end of this webinar. Okay, so the topic of conflicting work and family demands during the pandemic has been widely discussed and publicized in the media. And maybe you are someone who struggled navigating both sets of responsibilities, or you have a family member or a friend or lots of friends who have been trying to balance work and family in the face of school and childcare closures. And anecdotally, we know that additional work created by the pandemic fell primarily on women. But this is not just an anecdotal story. Research conducted during the pandemic backs this up. This is one example from Pew Research Center. So this chart shows the percentage of teleworking parents with various amounts of childcare responsibilities when working from home. And from this chart, we can see that most parents were affected by those additional responsibilities. And specifically, 26% of all parents working from home said that they had a lot of childcare responsibilities. However, if you look at the breakdown of answers by gender, slightly below, you can see that these effects have been gendered. So 36% of all mothers reported having a lot of childcare versus 16% of fathers. So last fall, teleworking moms were about twice as likely to say that they had a lot of childcare responsibilities compared to fathers. Other research has showed that as a result of childcare demands, mothers decreased their hours of paid labor significantly more than fathers. And this more unequal division of household labor has had negative effects on mental and emotional well-being, as well as relationship satisfaction. So considering the impact and widespread effects, we wanted to know the processes behind these statistics and trends. And so this leads me to our research question, our research topic. So we wanted to know how couples navigated household labor during the COVID-19 pandemic and how women ended up saddled with more work. In our research, we define household labor as consisting of housework, such as cooking and cleaning. It also includes care work, like routine childcare tasks, teaching children, and playing with children. And finally, household labor also encompasses the cognitive labor required to manage housework and care work. And that includes making doctor's appointments, scheduling vet appointments, keeping track of everything, paying the bills, and so forth.
So we wanted to know how couples with young children navigated household labor during the pandemic. So we decided to study couples. And to be part of our study, couples were all in different sex marriages. They had to have children that were 12 years or younger. Both spouses had to be employed to be in our study, and at least one spouse had to be working from home. All of our couples were living in Southern California at the time, and none of them were living with their own parents, so their children's grandparents. And we chose this criteria for our study sample because it really is almost a worst case scenario of work-family conflict, right? Both parents are working, at least one is working from home, and they have young children with high childcare demands and limited familial help with childcare. So how did we study these couples during the pandemic? We ended up collecting data on 31 couples or 62 spouses, and we collected this data from September to December of 2020. And the data we collected consisted of two different things. So for each spouse, we did a pre-interview survey. So spouses took this survey separately, and it had questions about who does what household tasks, like cleaning and childcare, and kind of the proportion that they and the other household members do of those tasks. And then we also did a separate interview with each spouse. And the interview consisted of more open-ended questions like, can you walk me through a typical day for you? These interviews were pretty flexible, which allowed us to ask follow-up questions. So here are some of the demographic characteristics of our sample. And you can see this table is divided into the women and men who are part of our sample. You can also see that it's fairly racially diverse, and this just reflects the larger Southern California region where our couples were drawn from. The other thing worth noting in this table is that the spouses in our sample are fairly highly educated, and they have fairly high incomes when compared to the rest of the US population. Right, so before we go into the stories from our interviews, I want to show you this table, which shows that women in our sample did more of the housework and childcare created by the pandemic than the men in our sample. So this data comes from our pre-interview survey, where each spouse was separately asked how much of the new pandemic-related housework and childcare they did. Women were more likely to say they did all or most of these new pandemic-related tasks. So they said they did all or most of the new pandemic-related housework. This included things like sanitizing. So 35% of women did all or most of that pandemic housework, whereas only 8% of men said they did all or most of it. And the gender gap was even bigger when we look at the new childcare tasks created by the pandemic. So this included things like supervising children's virtual learning. 59% of women in our sample said they did all or most of the new childcare, whereas only 15% of men said they did all or most of it. So this table shows that our sample is very similar to the couples in the US more broadly that Dr. Abramovich-Ute talked about earlier, in that women took on more of the pandemic-related household labor. So now we want to present some of the data from our interviews that shows how the conditions of the pandemic ended up worsening inequality within the couples we studied. So we find three mechanisms or reasons for this increase in inequality. The first is that gendered expectations that existed before the pandemic expanded to new domains during the pandemic. The second is that family myths justified unequal arrangements during the pandemic. And the third is that behaviors reinforced women's responsibility over pandemic-created tasks.
Okay, so from previous research, we know that women often see themselves and also are viewed by others as responsible for housework and childcare. So this gendered expectation existed long before the pandemic. However, the onset of the pandemic created a host of new responsibilities, including childcare, monitoring virtual learning, as well as new household tasks like sanitizing. And being part of the domestic sphere, these new tasks activated internalized norms and expectations, which resulted in increased household labor for women. In the context of the pandemic, we observed these robust gendered expectations in two ways. First, there was a lack of explicit conversation among spouses about how they would divide and handle new tasks. Second, we observed a distinctive linguistic pattern casting husbands as helping to complete new pandemic-related labor. So in other words, these unspoken expectations were expressed and reinforced through language. That is how both spouses spoke about men's role in regard to housework and childcare. So I'm going to share with you some quotes that exemplify each of these two mechanisms. The first one comes from Melissa and Garrett. So Melissa and Garrett are married, they have one child, and throughout the pandemic, Melissa had been the one responsible for supervising their son's virtual learning. When asked whether she and Garrett have discussed how they were going to handle this new reality, Melissa said, no, we did not have a conversation for sure. It probably just sort of happened organically. Her husband, Garrett, said no, because, well, she was going to be at home too, because her school got closed too. So no, we did not have a conversation. It's important to note that Garrett was also working from home during the pandemic, and this was an arrangement that preceded the pandemic. Melissa, on the other hand, had not been working from home before. She had had to convert her courses to online modality and teach from home. So the pandemic had made their already unequal division or arrangement even more unequal by adding homeschooling to Melissa's plate. Out of all the interviewed couples, 10, which is about 1/3, reported not having an explicit conversation about who would do new tasks created by the pandemic. And interestingly, another 6 couples had diverging accounts, meaning that one spouse said that they had conversation, whereas the other one claimed that they did not. So this suggests to us that the conversation the conversation may not have been explicit or may not have addressed all key aspects of housework and care work. Another way that deeply gendered expectations showed up was through the language with which spouses described fathers' role in the home. So fathers were often described as helping or needed to help more. I'm going to show you a quote from Rebecca, who's married to Anthony, and they have 2 children. So when asked what she thought of how they divided the childcare and housework, Rebecca said, I think that it would be better if I had a little bit more help, but I don't want to say that, he doesn't do anything. He helps. He does dishes, he does laundry, he does things. So we can see throughout this quote how Rebecca thinks of Anthony as occupying a helping role when it comes to housework and childcare. Likewise, Anthony said, I try and help when I can. So this sort of helping discourse was very common, and it demonstrates how both men and women, spouses think of women as ultimately and primarily responsible for the home and children. So this meant that as the pandemic created new tasks, women became automatically responsible for most of them.
Now I want to talk about how couples' family myths justified unequal arrangements during the pandemic. And by family myths, I mean the stories couples used to explain why they divided the household work in the way they did. We call these myths because they weren't necessarily true, as I'll explain. So a large part of our interviews were geared toward understanding why couples tackle the housework and childcare in the way that they do. And we received a really broad range of justifications from our interviewees. And so while those justifications varied, nearly all couples described their division of labor as rational, just as making sense to them. And besides the few references to biology, like mother's ability to breastfeed, most of the explanations couples used to justify their division of labor did not explicitly refer to gender. But the accounts portrayed by couples as gender neutral and purely rational often hid processes related to gender and justified women's greater labor in the home, particularly when it came to those new tasks like homeschooling that were created by the conditions of the pandemic. And what's more, certain family myths became more relevant to couples during the pandemic, like the flexibility of their work tasks. And these two were used to justify inequality between spouses. But as we'll show, these expectations broke down at closer inspection and were contradicted elsewhere in the interviews. So for example, husbands often constructed their work as more important, more urgent, and more inflexible, and thus more incompatible with childcare than the work of their wives. And during the pandemic, when couples were working from home and had to supervise children's virtual learning or care for younger children, these explanations justified why mothers would be responsible for a greater proportion of the household labor. Javi and Jessica de Leon provide a really good example of this. Throughout the pandemic, Jessica had been nearly solely responsible for caring for their 4 children and supervising their virtual learning. Javi explained this relationship as really their only choice because he needed the time and space away from home to do well in his job. He said, "But now, like I said, I'm all about numbers, about results. So I'm lucky enough for now to be doing really, really well because I have opened a lot of new business, but it's because I'm out of the home." She understands and she sees why there's no other decision, like, oh, I'm just letting her do the childcare. It's more of like literally no other option, and we have to see how we can do it. So here, Javi explains Jessica's responsibility over the children as their only option because of the nature of his work. Yet Javi contradicted himself elsewhere in the interview, saying his work was flexible 4 times because it largely consists of taking calls from clients, which he did from home before and throughout the pandemic. So we see this contradiction in the way Javi describes his job. Highly inflexible in the context of justifying why Jessica must care for their kids, but highly flexible elsewhere in the interview. On the other hand, Jessica's work was truly inflexible. She had a PhD and is currently a postdoctoral researcher. Because of the nature of her work, she quite literally had to be out of the house regularly in order to do it. She said, "I do have to go into the lab, and when I do go into the lab, it has to be the same time every day for 3 days because I run experiments and it's bacteria." The priority the couple had placed on Javi's career had taken a really serious toll on Jessica's. She reported being able to only do 2 to 4 hours of paid labor per day, and she had only recently returned to the lab after months away. She worried she would no longer be able to get a job as a professor after her postdoc was over. But she also told us this family myth, describing her husband's work as urgent and inflexible, justifying why he did not supervise their children's virtual learning. Javi's inaction around childcare reinforced this myth and the unspoken expectation that Jessica would ultimately do the childcare. Couples' family myths often justified unequal divisions of labor, even despite couples' intentions and circumstances. Grace and Louis Abbott are a good example of this. The Abbotts have 3 children, a 4-year-old and twin toddlers, and Grace, who's a social worker, began working from home because of the pandemic, but Louis, who works in construction, continued to work outside the home. Their children's childcare had closed twice during the pandemic for 2 weeks at a time, and the couple decided Louis would care for the children during those times. The first time he took off work to care for them, and the second time he had been furloughed from his job. Yet Grace had to take on more childcare than they had initially planned, which she attributed to the children's preference and breastfeeding. She said, "They take 2 naps a day and I have to nurse them each to sleep. And then they're just screaming and just throwing a fit with my husband. And I hear him in the other room getting exasperated and getting frustrated that they're crying. So I'm not going to sit in the bedroom and do my work. I'm going to go tend to my kids. It's just the kids, the babies in particular, they just want me." Grace went on to explain that she was able to get very little work done during the childcare closures, essentially caring for the children despite her and Louis' plan. And in his interview, Louis also cited the children's preference and breastfeeding as reasons why their plan hadn't worked. This was the Abbotts' agreed upon explanation, but Grace contradicted it later in her interview, explaining that Louis' lack of effort and skill with their younger children played an important role in her disrupted work. She said, But at the same time, there are plenty of times where the toddlers would be upset and they didn't want a nurse, and I would figure out other ways to comfort them, rocking them or holding them or interacting with them. And he doesn't think, let me grab a toy and play with them. Grace went on to explain that Louis' lack of engagement with the kids meant he didn't have the skills or knowledge to care for their children when their daycare closed. She explained that he had done little of the childcare since their babies were born, leaving her to, quote, figure it out. And by the time the pandemic hit and their children's daycares had closed, Louis had not figured it out and was unable to take on more of that responsibility despite their plan. The Abbott's earlier division of labor set a strong precedent for this moment of crisis. So to summarize this theme, the family myths couples used explained why women would be responsible for more household labor in the new context of the pandemic. But in many cases, those myths unraveled when we asked more questions.
Okay, so the last mechanism that we would like to discuss are certain behaviors that reinforced women's responsibility during the pandemic. And perhaps the most powerful way behaviors influenced the gender division of labor was fathers' lack of action in regard to housework and also childcare. This lack of action ranged from not having an explicit conversation at the onset of drastic pandemic-related changes, which we already discussed, to simply neglecting tasks that need to get done. In addition to their lack of action, fathers engaged in specific behaviors that resulted in leisure gap, meaning that they had significantly more leisure time than mothers. So even though the pandemic stripped all parents, regardless of gender, of leisure time, men acted to preserve their hobbies and leisure activities and were more successful at that than women. Okay, I'll give you some examples to illustrate that. So Anne and Edward Drossi, a couple raising 2 children, represent a quite extreme example of this pattern. Despite their families' increased in housework and childcare responsibilities, Edward had actually increased the amount of time he spent surfing to nearly every morning, while Anne had given up nearly all of her leisure activities. So in between her full-time job, childcare, and household chores, Anne reported having about 30 minutes of free time, which was a stark contrast to Edward's ample time spent surfing. When she tried to secure time to go hiking, she explained that there was very little room to negotiate with Edward. His hobbies rang here, while mine are like here. For instance, he always surfs in the morning because it's just better, whatever. I think I prefer to go hiking first thing in the morning before the sun is totally up and stuff like that. And he's like, no, you can't. You can do that any time of the day. And I'm like, no, but I want to do it in the morning because it's hot. And he's like, no. And he always gets to do it. I would have to send him a calendar invite and be like, do not go surfing. I'm busy. You are watching the kids. Even then he would be like, are you sure you're gonna go hiking? Can I go surfing? It's that bad. In contrast, Edward said that the pandemic was beneficial to his work-life balance. At some point during the pandemic, he was laid off. And after being laid off, he found another job that allowed him to work from home. Unlike Anne's experience, this meant that he could convert the time he saved from not commuting into free time. He said, I used to take the train and like it was just by Fridays, I was exhausted from commuting. I'm a big surfer, so I surf a lot more now because I have a much better quality of life. The Rosses demonstrate how the context of the pandemic had drastically different consequences for mothers and fathers, in part because of fathers' lack of action around household work and intentional preservation of their leisure time. Under the time crunch created by the merging of work and family life during the pandemic, mothers were the ones who faced the most severe repercussions. And this was partly due to fathers' actions and inactions in regard to household labor.
So we just want to summarize here. We find that the pandemic created conditions, risks, and restrictions that worsened the gender division of labor for 3 reasons. First, gendered expectations that existed before the pandemic expanded to new domains like homeschooling that were the result of the pandemic. And second, new and old family myths justified these unequal arrangements. And third, behaviors reinforced women's responsibility over new pandemic-related tasks. The intensification of the gender division of labor had important consequences for the mothers in our sample, particularly in terms of their ability to complete their paid labor, their time for hobbies and self-care, and their relationships with their husbands. The mechanisms we identified allowed families to navigate the uncertainty of the pandemic, but that came at the expense of women specifically and gender equality more broadly, with consequences we think extending beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. So what are some key takeaways or lessons from our research? Of course, we want to preface this by saying couples need to determine what feels right and fair in their particular situation. And we're not here to tell every couple to take care of their household labor in one specific way. But we have some recommendations for finding an arrangement that feels right to both spouses. So first, have explicit conversations about new tasks and who will do them. We saw in situations like Melissa and Garrett's that when couples don't have conversations, most of the work ends up on women's plates. Second, reflect on your existing arrangements and renegotiate. If something doesn't seem sustainable or fair, broach the topic with your partner. 3, don't wait until your spouse asks for help, and this kind of combines with number 4, don't wait until your spouse reaches their breaking point. Many of the women we interviewed reported being very overwhelmed with this extra workload and reaching a breaking point. Their situations could have been improved if they or their spouses had intervened before that crisis point. 5, prioritize self-care and leisure time for you and your spouse. Make sure both spouses are getting the rest they need within, the limitations of reality. 6, be deliberate when negotiating housework and childcare arrangements early on in relationships as they set precedents and build skills. So we saw with Grace and Louie that early arrangements impact who can do what skills they build. When both spouses have skills to do housework and childcare, they're more flexible in times of crisis like the pandemic. And then the last one, the state and federal safety net could alleviate the burden on families with young children. We know that the state and federal governments could do more to help families with young children during the pandemic and also beyond. So thank you so much for coming. We're really looking forward to your questions. This is how you can reach us both by email and by Twitter. And we also want to thank the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations for inviting us to have this webinar. It's been such a pleasure. And this slide shows how you can contact the ICDFR. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that important talk. I learned a lot and there are several questions. So why don't I start with a question that really comes off your last point that you just mentioned on the slide about, the role of the employer or government. So one person asked whether your research points to employers and or the government to support equity in the distribution of household labor, maybe just sharing any ideas you have on that topic.
Sure, I can just start by talking about employers. We saw a lot of variation over the spouses we interviewed in terms of how understanding their employers were in terms of the responsibilities they had at home. Both in general, but also as time went on, right? So we conducted these interviews over the course of several months. And so I think some folks as employers stopped being so understanding after many months. And so I think that's one way employers can support their employees. But I wonder if we did this analysis that we would see that women were more likely to report that their employees were supportive, which of course I think would speak to employers, right, managers' bias in terms of who they expect to be doing that household labor. So I think that's something we need to look at. I think also, of course, employers have a role in how do you evaluate employees during this time? And how do you make sure that those employees who did have more household responsibilities during this time, who are more likely to be women, that promotion and retention processes are fair for them, given those additional responsibilities?
Yeah, I just want to add my couple cents. So in regards to some of the policies that initially meant to maybe alleviate workload uh, from employees with those increased household responsibilities, especially women, um, they might mask inequalities or inequities for the future. So, for example, one that I can think of, delaying the time of, when someone's going up for promotion because of the pandemic, and those additional responsibilities can actually result in more inequalities in the future, because those with increased responsibilities, they are basically putting off the time of going up for promotion and getting the increase in salaries and so forth. So initially those policies may seem like they are very supportive, but they mask major inequalities. So that's just something that I wanted to know.
Okay, one question we have is in regards to your interviews. Did you notice that, did you notice any differences, I guess, between the spouses in terms of what they believe they are contributing? So, in other words, do you think anybody was overestimating or underestimating their contributions, or did you notice through your interviews if it was matched in terms of what women were reporting and men? Does it seem to pan out, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I can start, and maybe Dr. Kieran can add. Yeah, one thing that I noticed is that, and I think we both noticed that, is that women tend to minimize their contributions, and men, on the other hand, they tend to maximize theirs. So oftentimes, for example, a woman's spouse would say, "Oh, I just give them a ride to school and back. It's really not a big deal." So they tend to underestimate how much they contribute, and they always feel like they should be perhaps doing more and kind of dealing with that internal guilt as well. Whereas men, it's an empirical finding that fathers did increase their contributions during the pandemic, however, not enough to match those of mothers, and they do tend to perceive those contributions as greater than they probably are.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we could see that in the survey data and the interview data. So in the survey, we asked, each spouse separately for each of the tasks we listed, what proportion of this work do you do, and what proportion do the other members in your household do? And so we can also see kind of that, definitely on behalf of husbands, maximizing what they do compared to what wives were reporting their husbands do. And I think one really good example of the minimizing, maximizing was Grace and Louie, who we quoted in the interviews. In the interviews, it was very clear that Grace was doing almost all of the childcare when their children were not at daycare. And Louie kind of countered that by saying, actually, the work we do is not, the term he used was equally yoked. That he perceived himself as doing a lot more work at home than she does, and kind of minimizing the 24/7 labor of caring for 3 very young children at home.
Thank you. Another question is about relationship satisfaction and general satisfaction. Did you examine that variable to know if these added burdens on women were greatly impacting their satisfaction? And same goes with respect to men. Do you know if their satisfaction declined during the pandemic due to some of the shifts they experienced?
Would you like me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so we did not explicitly ask that question. However, we did ask the question of fairness. So how fair do you think the current arrangement is? And is there anything you would like to change? Are you happy with the current arrangement? So we did not ask the overall general relationship satisfaction or happiness question, but we kind of zoomed in on fairness. However, those feelings they did, or perceptions, they did come through in our interviews, and we documented tensions and arguments and breaking points in the relationship. So it has been really evident that the pandemic has put a lot of strain on the couples, and some of the couples avoided those conversations perhaps to keep the relationship intact. So that was probably one of the reasons why maybe they chose not to have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add that I think one of the main functions of those family myths we talked about was really preserving the relationship, right? If couples can agree on the reason why this arrangement doesn't feel fair, but it doesn't have to do with, them or their spouse, then that kind of preserves their relationship and prevents conflict.
And also, I'm just going to add one more thing. So I would say that our research may be slightly biased towards the couples that are more harmonious, or they get along more than maybe the general population, because just the fact that they both agreed to participate in the study meant that they have to get along enough to actually coordinate that and say, okay, well, let's take this, let's participate in this. So I would say probably those couples were more functional and more getting along better than maybe some other ones who would not have agreed to participate in such a study.
Mm-hmm. And definitely communicating and coordinating with one another more. Yeah.
That's a very good point. This one is more of a comment, but perhaps leads into a question. It would be interesting to see why so many of these men do not feel the need to help with childcare, or why they decide to not offer help with childcare. I don't know if you have any thoughts to share there, but I guess one of the other questions that kind of links up with this one is regarding cultural values as well. I guess cultural values and gender role conformity, perhaps like the extent to which couples believe that certain roles belong to particular genders. So I'll just leave that to you to comment.
Yeah, I think the question as to why many of the fathers we interviewed weren't asking their wives what they could do, or weren't kind of proactively engaging in more household labor. I think that goes back to those unspoken gender expectations, right? Those are really, they're really ingrained both in kind of the culture and in institutions. And so I think that really structures the way people act and the way people think. And so it shapes that for sure. Yeah, I think we did see in our interviews too, recognition on the part of the husbands we interviewed that things weren't fair, and that maybe they should be talking to their wives more. Several husbands talked about that. So there is some recognition, but it's these gendered expectations are so strong and kind of easy to fall into, right? Household labor is a huge way that people perform their gender, right? That they act like men and women through their household labor, and so it's an easy pattern to fall into.
Yeah, I would say that in some cases, or in a lot of cases, it's very much household labor is very much tied to people's identities. So again, just to piggyback on what Dr. Kurian said, it's how we express our femininity or masculinity, and in some couples that it came through strongly. I think it was Melissa who said she really, even if he offered more help, she wants to be hands-on in terms of parenting and just really involved in that process. So I would say it's a complex issue. There are so many different factors, but one of them is definitely how we construct our identities and how we express them in the domestic sphere.
And as to the question of like, how do spouses' gender ideology shape, how they're dividing housework? So before the pandemic, there's been lots of research on that, right? Are couples that have more egalitarian gender ideologies more likely to have more egalitarian divisions of labor? And in our sample, we see not necessarily, right? So we have several interviewees who talked about wanting their division of labor to be fair and not thinking things like household labor should be determined by your gender, right? But again, I think gendered expectations and performances, and also, how those things are built into institutions and structures, that's sometimes impossible to move past, right? Just by intention alone. And so we do have egalitarian couples in our sample. And what they did, right, they also had egalitarian ideologies, but the way they kind of accomplished that egalitarian division of labor was by being really intentional. So a lot of these couples had almost like chore wheels that you might have with a roommate, right? One couple described having this spreadsheet of like how they would switch off doing different tasks. So they were very intentional. They were having those explicit conversations, and that's kind of how they were able to translate the ideology to the actual egalitarian division of labor.
That's very interesting. And a good idea. Perhaps some people can get some ideas from these couples to what to implement. Okay, here's another question. There's a media narrative that more women's jobs were lost during the pandemic. Did you find any sign of job loss systematically impacting women in your data? Would job loss for a man get him to do more work at home?
So both spouses in our couples had to be employed at the time we interviewed them. So I don't think we can answer with our data that first question about, was there a pattern in who was losing their job during the pandemic. Do you want to answer the second question?
I can maybe just add a little bit. We did notice that a lot of women scaled back on their career progress. I am recalling one filmmaker. She was an independent filmmaker where basically her career was put on hold. She was just engaging in tasks that were not necessarily moving her forward in the long run. And the same we can probably say about some of the scholars, kind of attending to the immediate tasks, but not being able to work on the long-term projects that actually are the ones that will result in career gains, 2, 3, or 4 or 5 years later. So we saw those subtle but very important ways in which they scaled back on their career, I wouldn't say ambitions, but the actual things they were able to do during this time.
Yeah, and we did have a couple men in our sample who had been laid off or unemployed at some point during the pandemic before the interview. They had found new jobs, and that's why they're in our sample. But the examples I can remember off the top of my head, those husbands had not increased their household labor during the time they were unemployed. So Edward was a good example of that. He, Anne talked about him going surfing while he was unemployed and not kind of taking more things off her plate. And that was a major point of conflict for them during that time. There was another example. So Louis actually, again, was furloughed during that time. Their plan was that he would take care of the kids when the daycare closed, but they weren't able to execute that plan. And so we didn't see when men were unemployed that they were stepping up their household labor. And there's research, that took place before the pandemic that fits with that finding that when men lose their jobs, they're not necessarily doing more household labor. Because again, as we talked about earlier, that's really a way to perform masculinity in the home.
Thank you. I think a question that kind of follows along those lines. Does going to work outside the home provide enough of a break for the spouse, or does that spouse need additional leisure time and breaks?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how to approach that.
I'm sure it really depends. I think one thing that's related that we saw was that lots of spouses talked about actually missing their commute as like alone time. Time to like listen to a podcast or zone out. Missing that kind of leisure time.
Yeah, I had exactly the same thing to say, is that people reporting that they miss actually driving to work and coming back because that's their time to unwind and listen to music and podcasts. So
Yeah, so I think for those people, it wasn't just being outside of the home, right? Like being at work, it was also time to themselves, which, I mean, all of us who live with someone know that time to yourself really decreased during the pandemic. And definitely that showed up during interviews, people missing that.
Would you consider doing additional research to explore the house/labor differences in same gender couples?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's definitely one we haven't answered. And I don't know if we have plans to do that. One of our plans is to follow up with these couples later to see if, what happened during the pandemic has a carryover effect, both in terms of their division of labor, right? Did women's labor ever decrease after schools reopened? And also to see how kind of the effects of on their long-term paid labor. Do you have any thoughts about how this would work in same-sex couples?
I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, we haven't really discussed expanding our research into the same-sex couples, but my hunch would be that same-sex couples are probably more egalitarian in this respect. Yeah, that probably would be my guess.
So you addressed some of this on your last slide. I'm not sure if you have anything additional to say, but one question is, what can women do to encourage more participation from men regarding housework and childcare?
I would say, well, just have conversations, communicate, and especially, well, it might be too late for some of the couples, but the initial precedents are very important. The initial arrangements at the beginning of the relationship, they have strong carryover effects. So, if some of the people are at the beginning of the relationship, those are the questions that should be brought up and discussed. And then also when something unexpected happens structurally, like, the major pandemic strikes, it's important to have an explicit conversation, just address that with a spouse. And strangely, to us, a lot of people said that they had no time to talk. So one of the dominant, I would say, an excuse or justification was just, oh, there was simply no time. Everything happened so suddenly. But it seems like those things can be discussed in an evening, or it's just something that really calls for a conversation. So probably having conversation would be, I think, the most important thing that couples can do.
Yeah, I would agree. I think communication would be the number one takeaway that we saw in couples that had egalitarian relationships. They were having conversations about their arrangement. And I'd also just add that conversation doesn't happen just once, right? It happens over and over and over again until couples can find an arrangement that feels sustainable and fair to them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, with that, I'd like to conclude our question and answer period, and I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to you, our speakers today, and to all of our attendees for joining us and participating in today's webinar, which was hosted by the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at California State University, San Bernardino. At the ICDFR, we've been providing guidance for parents and families based on science and best practice since 2002. To hear more from us, please like us and follow us on Facebook. You can also visit our YouTube page. That's where we archive all our previous webinars, including this one will be posted there. You can also learn more about our projects by visiting our website at www.csusb.edu/ICDFR. So again, thank you for joining us, everyone, and have a wonderful day and be well. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.